Dr. Elijah Carter's hands gripped the steering wheel as the family SUV approached the town of Cedarville, a picturesque yet unfamiliar place they hoped to call home. Beside him, his wife Lauren gazed out the window, her expression a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. In the back seat, their children, Sophie and Nathan, eagerly scanned the charming streets filled with small shops and tall oak trees. "It's so cozy here," Sophie exclaimed, pressing her hands and nose against the window. Her excitement was infectious, and Elijah couldn't help but smile. "It sure is, sweetheart," he replied, his voice steady but filled with quiet determination. "This is our fresh start." The Carters had left behind the hectic pace of their big city life for the promise of a close-knit, peaceful community. As they turned onto Pine Grove Lane, their new neighborhood, Elijah pointed towards a charming two-story house with light blue siding and a welcoming front porch. "Here it is, kids," he announced with a hint of pride. "Our new home." The family quickly spilled out of the car, stretching their legs after the long drive. Nathan darted to the backyard, his shouts of glee echoing as he discovered a swing set under a grand oak tree. Meanwhile, Lauren wrapped an arm around Elijah, her voice soft but hopeful. "We've got this," she said. "It'll take time, but we'll make it work." Just as they started unpacking boxes, an elderly couple walking their golden retriever approached from the sidewalk. The man raised a hand in greeting, while his wife offered a warm smile. "Hello there," the man called out. "You must be the new neighbors. I'm Greg, and this is my wife, Evelyn." Elijah stepped forward, extending his hand. "Elijah Carter. This is my wife, Lauren, and our kids, Sophie and Nathan. It's great to meet you." The exchange was polite but tinged with subtle curiosity from the older couple. Despite the friendly introduction, Elijah couldn't ignore the way Greg's gaze lingered on him, as if sizing him up. "Welcome to Cedarville," Evelyn said, her tone genuine but cautious. "It's a lovely town, though it can be different for newcomers." Elijah nodded, choosing to interpret her words as well-intentioned. "Thank you. We're excited to settle in." Monday morning arrived swiftly, and Elijah found himself standing outside the imposing brick facade of Cedarville Regional Hospital. His white coat was freshly pressed, and his stethoscope hung neatly around his neck. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and walked inside. The hospital was smaller than the urban medical center where Elijah had previously worked, but its facilities were clean and organized. At the reception desk, a stern-looking nurse with silver-streaked hair greeted him briskly. "Dr. Carter?" she asked, her tone formal. "I'm Nurse Jenkins. Follow me. I'll show you your office." As Elijah followed her through the maze of hallways, he noticed the subtle glances from other staff members. Some nodded politely, while others quickly averted their gaze. In his modest new office, he unpacked a few books and set up personal touches, like a photo of his family. Just as he was settling in, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," he called. The door opened to reveal a tall man with a commanding presence. "Dr. Carter, I presume?" "I'm Dr. Wallace, the chief of medicine here. Welcome to Cedarville Regional." Elijah rose to shake his hand, noting the firm grip and measured smile. "Thank you, Dr. Wallace. I'm eager to get started." "Well," Dr. Wallace replied, glancing at the office, "we've got plenty for you to do. Today you'll be shadowing Dr. Harris on rounds. It'll give you a feel for how things work around here." As Elijah navigated his first day, it became clear that his new colleagues were polite but distant. In the break room, conversations fell silent as he entered, resuming only when he left. Elijah tried not to let it bother him, reminding himself that trust and camaraderie took time to build. While Elijah adjusted to his new job, Lauren faced her own challenges, helping Sophie and Nathan prepare for their first day at Cedarville Elementary. That morning, as they stood on the school steps, Nathan hesitated. "What if nobody likes us here?" he asked, his voice small. Lauren crouched to his level, her eyes brimming with reassurance. "Listen to me, sweetheart. You're kind, smart, and brave. Be yourself, and everything will fall into place." Sophie chimed in, though her brow furrowed with concern. "Mommy, the kids next door said we're different. What does that mean?" Lauren's smile faltered for only a moment before she replied with calm confidence. "It means we're special, honey. And special is a good thing." After walking them to their classrooms, Lauren lingered outside the schoolyard, watching the other parents. While some smiled in greeting, others whispered to each other, their expressions unreadable. She steeled herself, determined to make Cedarville feel like home for her family. Elijah Carter found himself working late into the evening at Cedarville Regional Hospital. The unfamiliar routines and unspoken social dynamics of the staff made every task feel heavier, more deliberate. While he wanted to believe that his new colleagues were simply adjusting to his presence, the lingering looks and whispered conversations left a subtle but clear impression. He was being scrutinized. As he wrapped up his paperwork for the day, his thoughts drifted to Lauren and the kids. He longed for the comfort of their laughter, their voices pulling him back from the growing weight of doubt and isolation he felt. Across town, Lauren was busy preparing dinner. She glanced at the clock, the soft ticking a reminder of how late Elijah would be. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, coloring a picture of their new house, while Nathan fiddled with a puzzle on the floor. Lauren's phone buzzed on the counter and she wiped her hands quickly before answering. "Hello?" she said, her tone upbeat, despite the exhaustion she felt creeping into her voice. The voice on the other end belonged to Martha, their neighbor. "Hi, Lauren. I was just calling to see how you're settling in," Martha said, her tone friendly but cautious. Lauren paused, surprised by the call. "Oh, hi, Martha. We're doing okay, just trying to find our rhythm here. It's a lovely town." "That's good to hear," Martha replied, though there was a hint of hesitation in her voice. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." The conversation was brief, but left Lauren feeling both hopeful and wary. It was a small step toward connection, yet the unspoken undertone in Martha's voice hinted at something more. Something unspoken, lingering beneath Cedarville's picturesque surface. Later that evening, Elijah stopped by the local grocery store to pick up a few things before heading home. The small aisles were nearly deserted, save for a young cashier scrolling on his phone behind the register. As Elijah selected a few staples, bread, milk, a box of cereal for the kids, he felt the faint pull of someone's gaze. Turning, he saw an older man in a flannel shirt studying him from the corner of the produce section. Elijah offered a polite nod, but the man simply looked away, adjusting his grip on a bag of apples. At the register, the cashier rang up Elijah's items without much enthusiasm. "Evening," Elijah said, trying to break the awkward silence. The cashier, whose name tag read Jason, barely looked up. "Evening," he mumbled. The exchange was brief, but as Elijah walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, like he was a puzzle piece trying to fit into the wrong picture. The next morning, the Carters' routine was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. Lauren opened it to find a uniformed officer standing on their porch. Her heart skipped a beat as she stepped outside, closing the door slightly behind her to shield the children from the sight. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer began, his tone neutral but firm. "We're conducting a follow-up about a recent incident at the gas station down the road. I'd like to ask you and your husband a few questions." Lauren blinked, her mind racing. "Of course," she said cautiously. "But I'm not sure how we could help. What kind of incident are you referring to?" "There was a robbery," the officer explained, his expression unreadable. "And we're talking to residents in the area as part of our investigation." Lauren nodded slowly. "Elijah's at work right now, but you're welcome to come back later when he's home." The officer handed her a business card. "We'll be in touch," he said before turning and walking back to his car. As Lauren watched him drive away, a heavy unease settled in her chest. When Elijah returned home that evening, Lauren relayed the encounter. "They're asking everyone questions," she said, trying to sound calm. But it felt strange. Elijah frowned as he listened. "It's probably just routine," he said, though his own voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "We don't have anything to hide." Yet, as the days passed, the weight of the officer's visit lingered in both their minds. Meanwhile, whispers about the robbery spread through Cedarville. At the hospital, Elijah overheard snippets of conversations among staff in the break room. "I heard they think it was someone new in town," one nurse murmured to another. "Makes sense," came the reply. "Someone who doesn't know their way around yet." Elijah felt the sting of the words, though they weren't directed at him explicitly. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the town's quiet scrutiny was beginning to center on him. Lauren faced her own challenges. At the school, other parents were polite but distant, their conversations always stopping short when she approached. Sophie and Nathan began to share small but telling observations. "Mommy," Nathan said one afternoon, "why do the kids at recess not play with me?" Lauren knelt to his level, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Sometimes people take time to get to know someone new," she said gently. "Just keep being kind, and they'll come around." That night, as the family sat down for dinner, the tension was palpable. Elijah tried to lighten the mood by asking Sophie about her art project, and Lauren encouraged Nathan to share his progress on his puzzle. But beneath the surface, both parents felt the unspoken weight of their growing unease. They had come to Cedarville seeking peace and belonging, but it seemed that the community was keeping them at arm's length, unwilling to fully embrace them. As the days turned into weeks, the Carters' sense of isolation deepened. Elijah continued to face subtle but persistent barriers at work, while Lauren struggled to build connections in the neighborhood. Even simple errands felt fraught with tension, as if every interaction carried an undercurrent of judgment. Yet despite these challenges, they clung to each other, determined to find a way forward in a town that seemed reluctant to accept them. One evening, as Elijah was leaving the hospital after another long shift, he decided to stop by the gas station where the robbery had occurred. The station was eerily quiet under the harsh glow of its fluorescent lights, the lingering air of unease palpable even weeks after the incident. Elijah picked up a bottle of water and a snack for the drive home. At the counter, the attendant glanced at him with an expression Elijah couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part apprehension. "Evening," Elijah offered, his tone friendly yet cautious. "Quiet night?" The young man nodded but said nothing, quickly ringing up the purchase. Elijah thanked him and walked back to his car, feeling the weight of the attendant's gaze following him until he pulled out of the lot. The next day, while Elijah was at work, Lauren received another knock at the door. This time, it was two officers. Their faces were serious, their tone curt. "Mrs. Carter, is your husband home?" one asked. Lauren stood in the doorway, her hands gripping the edge of the doorframe. "No, he's at the hospital. Is something wrong?" The officer hesitated before replying. "We have some questions for him regarding the robbery at the gas station. Can you let him know we'll be stopping by later?" Lauren nodded, her stomach twisting into knots. As soon as they left, she called Elijah, her voice trembling as she recounted the encounter. "Why would they want to talk to you again?" she asked. Elijah sighed heavily. "I don't know, Lauren. Maybe they're just being thorough." But the unease between them grew. That evening, after the kids were in bed, they sat at the kitchen table, the weight of their fears hanging in the air. "Do you think they suspect you?" Lauren asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah shook his head, though his confidence was waning. "I don't see how they could. I was at the hospital that night. They can check my records." Yet, as the days passed, the visits from law enforcement became more frequent, and their questions more pointed. They asked about his routine, his movements that evening, even his interactions with other townsfolk. Despite his answers, it became clear that their focus was narrowing on him. Word of the police's interest in Elijah began to spread through Cedarville. At the hospital, his colleagues became even more distant. Conversations ceased entirely when he entered a room, and patients began requesting other doctors. Lauren experienced similar treatment in the neighborhood. People she'd once hoped to befriend now avoided her entirely, their polite smiles replaced by cold indifference. Even Sophie and Nathan began noticing the change. "Mom?" Sophie asked one evening. Why doesn't anyone want to sit with me at lunch anymore? Lauren hugged her tightly, her heart breaking for her children. It's not your fault, sweetheart, she said, though her words felt hollow even to herself. The tension reached its breaking point one night when Elijah was pulled over on his way home from work. The officer who approached his car asked him to step out and subjected him to a series of questions under the pretense of a routine traffic stop. "You were at the gas station last week, weren't you?" the officer asked, his tone accusatory. "I was buying a bottle of water," Elijah replied, his patience wearing thin. "Is that a crime?" The officer didn't answer directly, instead scrutinizing Elijah's driver's license as if searching for something incriminating. Finally, he handed it back and told Elijah he could go. But the encounter left Elijah shaken, his sense of safety eroded. When Elijah told Lauren about the stop, her worry turned to anger. "This isn't right, Elijah. They're targeting you because you're new here, and because you're different," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. Elijah nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know, but what can we do? If I push back too hard, it'll only make things worse." Lauren reached for his hand. "We can't just sit back and let them treat you like this. We have to find someone who will listen, someone who can help." The Carters began reaching out for support, contacting advocacy groups and legal organizations. But time after time, they were met with polite refusals. "I'm sorry," one representative said over the phone. "We don't have the resources to take on new cases right now." Each rejection chipped away at their hope, but they refused to give up. Lauren spent hours researching similar cases, determined to find a way to protect her husband and clear his name. Meanwhile, tensions in Cedarville continued to escalate. Rumors swirled, fueled by fear and suspicion. At the grocery store, Elijah overheard snippets of conversation that made his blood run cold. "I heard he's been lying about being a doctor," one woman whispered. "Wouldn't surprise me if he was behind the robbery," another replied. Elijah clenched his fists, fighting the urge to confront them. He knew it would only make things worse. The breaking point came one evening when police arrived at their home with a warrant. Elijah stood in the doorway, stunned, as officers explained they were taking him into custody for questioning related to the robbery. Lauren clung to his arm, her voice shaking. "This is a mistake. My husband had nothing to do with this," she cried. "Please, ma'am, step back," one officer said, his tone firm but not unkind. Elijah turned to Lauren, his expression calm despite the storm raging inside him. "Take care of the kids," he said softly. "I'll be home soon." As the police car pulled away, Lauren stood on the porch, watching helplessly. Inside, Sophie and Nathan peeked out from behind the curtains, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Lauren took a deep breath and turned to them, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's going to be okay," she said, though her heart felt like it was breaking. At the station, Elijah was placed in a stark interrogation room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face. Detective Howard, a man with a stern demeanor and piercing eyes, sat across from him. "Dr. Carter," he began, his tone measured. "We have a witness who claims they saw someone matching your description near the gas station the night of the robbery." Elijah leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "I was at work that night. You can check my schedule, my patient records. I wasn't anywhere near the gas station until days later." Howard tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "We'll be verifying that. In the meantime, is there anything else you'd like to tell us?" Elijah shook his head. "I've already told you everything. I have nothing to hide because I didn't do anything wrong." Despite his calm demeanor, a knot of fear tightened in his chest. He knew how easily the truth could be ignored when suspicion had already taken root. When the questioning finally ended, Elijah was released on bail, but the damage had been done. As he stepped out of the station, the glare of the media's camera flashes blinded him. Reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic din. Elijah ignored them, his focus solely on getting back to his family. Elijah returned home to find Lauren waiting on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if bracing against the cold. She rushed to him the moment he stepped out of the car, pulling him into an embrace that conveyed her relief and exhaustion all at once. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah nodded, though the heaviness in his eyes told a different story. "I'm fine, just tired," he said, his words clipped. He wasn't ready to unpack the full weight of what he had just endured. Inside, Sophie and Nathan ran to him, their small arms wrapping around his legs. "Daddy, you're home," Nathan exclaimed, his voice tinged with both joy and a hint of worry. Elijah crouched down, pulling them close. "I'm here," he said softly, stroking their hair. "Everything's going to be okay." But as he looked up at Lauren, her expression mirroring his own unease, he knew the words were more for his children's comfort than his own belief. The days that followed were filled with a tense silence that seemed to envelop the entire household. Elijah went back to work, but the atmosphere at the hospital was more hostile than ever. Patients who had once seemed neutral now openly requested other doctors. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others whispered in hushed tones that stopped abruptly whenever he entered the room. The isolation was suffocating, and Elijah found himself questioning whether moving to Cedarville had been a mistake. Lauren, meanwhile, continued her tireless efforts to rally support for Elijah. She spent hours each day making calls, writing letters, and researching legal precedents. Her determination was unshakable, but the toll it took on her was evident in the dark circles under her eyes and the way her voice cracked when she spoke too long. One afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, her hands trembling slightly as she dialed yet another number. "Hi, this is Lauren Carter. I'm calling about my husband's case," she began, but the voice on the other end quickly interrupted. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter, but we can't take on any new cases right now." The line went dead before she could respond. Lauren stared at the phone, her jaw tightening. She refused to cry, not when there was still so much to do. At school, Sophie and Nathan faced their own struggles. Their classmates, once friendly and curious about the new kids, now avoided them. During recess, Sophie sat alone under the shade of a tree, her sketchbook resting on her knees. She drew pictures of their old home, her heart aching for the familiarity they had left behind. Nathan, too young to fully understand what was happening, tried to approach a group of boys playing soccer. "Can I join?" he asked, his voice hopeful. One of the boys shook his head, his tone dismissive. "We don't need any more players." Dejected, Nathan wandered back to the swings, kicking the dirt as he went. At night, after the kids were in bed, Elijah and Lauren sat together in the living room, the weight of their situation pressing down on them like a physical presence. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Lauren asked, breaking the silence. Elijah rubbed his temples, his shoulders slumping. "It doesn't feel like it," he admitted. "They've already decided I'm guilty. It doesn't matter what the truth is." Lauren reached for his hand, her grip firm and steady. "We'll fight this," she said, her voice filled with a determination that defied her exhaustion. "No matter what, we'll fight." Despite their resolve, the situation continued to escalate. A week later, Elijah was called to a formal hearing where the charges against him were read aloud. As he sat in the courthouse, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, he felt the weight of the town's collective judgment bearing down on him. The prosecutor, a man named Richard Hale, stood confidently at the front of the room. His sharp suit and calculated tone gave him an air of authority that seemed designed to sway the jury before they had even heard the evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hale began, his voice smooth and practiced, "we are here today to address a crime that has shaken the very foundation of our community. The robbery at Cedarville Gas and Grocery was not just a theft, it was a betrayal of trust. And today, we will show you that the man responsible is sitting right here in this courtroom." He gestured toward Elijah, his words landing like a physical blow. Elijah kept his face neutral, but inside, anger and frustration churned. He knew there was no solid evidence against him, yet Hale's words painted a picture of guilt that was hard to refute in the court of public opinion. The defense attorney, A soft-spoken woman named Karen Briggs rose to deliver her opening statement. My client, Dr. Elijah Carter, is a man of integrity, a healer who has dedicated his life to helping others. The accusations against him are not only baseless, but an affront to the very principles of justice. Her words were measured and calm, but Elijah could see the uphill battle she faced. The jury's expressions ranged from skeptical to outright hostile, their biases already clouding their judgment. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. A blurry security camera image, a vague description from a witness, and the fact that Elijah had been near the gas station days after the robbery were presented as damning proof. Each piece of evidence felt like another brick in the wall being built around him. Meanwhile, the defense struggled to counter the narrative. Karen pointed out the lack of direct evidence and presented records proving Elijah's alibi, but her arguments seemed to fall on deaf ears. The jury's collective gaze remained cold and unforgiving. During one particularly tense moment, a witness took the stand and claimed to have seen someone matching Elijah's description near the gas station the night of the robbery. "Are you absolutely certain it was Dr. Carter?" Karen asked during cross-examination. The witness hesitated, their confidence wavering. "Well, no, I suppose I can't be 100% sure," they admitted. But the damage was already done. The doubt had been planted, and the jury's expressions made it clear they were leaning toward a guilty verdict. Elijah's heart sank as he watched the trial unfold, feeling powerless to stop the avalanche of misinformation and prejudice. Every day, he sat in the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly together, praying for some miracle that would turn the tide. Lauren sat behind him, her presence a constant source of strength even as her own fears threatened to overwhelm her. Each time their eyes met, she gave him a small nod, silently reminding him that he wasn't alone. The day the verdict was read, the courtroom was filled with an oppressive silence. The jury foreman stood, clearing his throat before announcing the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. Elijah Carter, guilty." The word echoed in Elijah's mind, each syllable striking like a hammer. He felt Lauren's hand on his shoulder, her grip tightening as she stifled a sob. He turned to look at her, his expression a mixture of sorrow and determination. "It's not over," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. As the judge delivered the sentence, 3 years in prison, Elijah's world seemed to collapse around him. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, finalizing Elijah Carter's sentence. 3 years. The words carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present, but none more so than Elijah and his family. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, he turned to Lauren, his eyes filled with pain and determination. "Take care of the kids," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the whispers and murmurs from the crowd. Lauren reached out as if to hold on to him, but the officers moved him forward, and her outstretched hand fell to her side. Sophie and Nathan, seated behind her, clung to each other, their young faces etched with confusion and fear. The days that followed were some of the darkest the Carters had ever known. Elijah was transferred to a correctional facility a few hours outside of Cedarville. The initial intake process was grueling, hours of waiting, paperwork, and invasive procedures that stripped him of his dignity piece by piece. He was issued a standard orange jumpsuit and assigned to a small cell shared with another inmate, a quiet man named Terrence who kept mostly to himself. The stark environment of the prison was a world away from the life Elijah had built, and the adjustment was jarring. The constant noise, the lack of privacy, and the unspoken but ever-present tension among the inmates created an atmosphere that left him on edge. Back in Cedarville, Lauren faced the monumental task of keeping her family together while fighting to clear Elijah's name. She threw herself into researching legal avenues, reaching out to organizations that specialized in wrongful convictions, and speaking to anyone who might listen. The rejections came as frequently as the bills, piling up one after another. Yet, every night, after putting Sophie and Nathan to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and a stack of documents, determined to find a way forward. Meanwhile, the children struggled to cope with their father's absence and the stigma surrounding their family. At school, Sophie was teased by classmates who repeated the rumors they'd overheard from their parents. "Your dad's a thief," one boy sneered during recess. Sophie clenched her fists, her face red with anger, but she said nothing, retreating to her usual spot under the tree. Nathan, too young to fully grasp the situation, often asked Lauren, "When is Daddy coming home?" Each time she would kneel down, hold him close, and tell him, "Soon, sweetheart. Daddy loves you, and he's coming home as soon as we can bring him back." In prison, Elijah began to carve out a semblance of routine. Mornings started early with roll call, followed by menial jobs that kept the facility running. He spent much of his free time in the library, poring over books on law and criminal justice. He hoped to understand the system that had so cruelly failed him and to find any angle that might help his case. It was during one such visit to the library that he first caught the attention of another inmate, a wiry man named Marcus. "You a lawyer or something?" Marcus asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Elijah shook his head, closing the book he'd been reading. "Number, I'm a doctor," he replied simply. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A doctor? What's a doctor doing in here?" Elijah hesitated before answering. "Wrong place, wrong time. They think I did something I didn't." Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, that sounds about right. This place is full of people who got screwed over one way or another." Over time, Marcus became a quiet ally, guiding Elijah through the unspoken rules of prison life and introducing him to others who had found themselves caught in the same web of injustice. Elijah's medical background soon became known among the inmates. When one man, a burly figure named Ramon, collapsed in the yard during recreation, Elijah instinctively rushed to his side. "Give him space," he called out, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. He checked Ramon's pulse and noticed his labored breathing. "It's heat exhaustion," he said, looking up at the guards. "He needs water and to be moved to a cooler area." The guards hesitated, but when Ramon's condition worsened, they reluctantly followed Elijah's instructions. Word of the incident spread quickly, and inmates began seeking Elijah out for minor injuries and health concerns. Though he couldn't practice medicine officially, helping others gave him a sense of purpose that made the endless days a little more bearable. One day, Elijah received a letter from Lauren. Her familiar handwriting brought a flood of emotions as he opened the envelope and began to read. "Elijah, we miss you so much," the letter began. "The kids are doing their best to be brave, but they ask about you every day. Sophie's been drawing pictures for you, and Nathan talks about how he wants to be a doctor like his dad when he grows up." Elijah's chest tightened as he read her words, each one a lifeline that tethered him to the world beyond the prison walls. Lauren detailed her efforts to appeal his conviction, listing the lawyers she had contacted and the strategies they were pursuing. "It's hard, Elijah," she wrote, "but I won't stop fighting. I believe in you, and I know the truth will come out." The letter gave Elijah renewed strength. He folded it carefully and placed it under his mattress, knowing he would read it again and again in the days to come. That night, as he lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, he allowed himself to imagine the day he would walk out of the prison and return home to his family. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep him going. Meanwhile, in Cedarville, Lauren's persistence began to yield small victories. After weeks of outreach, she finally managed to secure a meeting with a lawyer named David Grant, who specialized in wrongful convictions. David was a middle-aged man with a kind but no-nonsense demeanor. As Lauren laid out Elijah's case, he listened intently, occasionally taking notes. "It's clear the prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence," he said when she finished. "But overturning a conviction is no easy task. We'll need to find something concrete, something that proves Elijah couldn't have committed the crime." Lauren nodded, her determination unwavering. "Whatever it takes," she said. "I'll do whatever it takes." David began reviewing the case in detail, uncovering discrepancies that had been overlooked during the trial. One piece of security footage from the gas station showed a blurry figure whose height and build didn't match Elijah's. Another witness, who had initially provided a vague description, admitted in a later interview that they weren't certain of what they'd seen. Slowly but surely, cracks began to form in the prosecution's narrative. As David worked on building a case for appeal, Lauren continued to rally support in the community. She reached out to local organizations, spoke at town meetings, and even started a social media campaign to raise awareness about Elijah's plight. While many in Cedarville remained skeptical, a small but growing number of people began to question the fairness of the trial. Among them was Martha, the neighbor who had initially kept her distance. One evening, she knocked on Lauren's door, her expression conflicted. "I've been thinking about what you said," Martha began, her voice hesitant. "And I think you're right. What happened to Elijah? It doesn't feel right." Lauren invited her inside, and the two women talked late into the night. Martha shared her own observations about the biases she had seen in Cedarville and offered to help spread the word about Elijah's case. It was a small gesture, but for Lauren, it felt like a glimmer of hope in the midst of overwhelming darkness. The fight for Elijah's freedom was far from over, but with every small step forward, the Carters began to feel the faintest stirrings of hope. Elijah, too, held on to that hope, drawing strength from Lauren's letters, his children's love, and the belief that justice, though slow, would eventually prevail. Richard glanced at his buzzing phone, his focus momentarily breaking from the mountain of paperwork on his desk. He hesitated before answering, knowing any interruption could derail his already strained workflow. Still, he picked up. Linda's voice came through immediately, tinged with worry. "Grace had another allergy attack at school today," she said, her tone calm but underlined with concern. "The nurse called me to pick her up." Richard sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose as tension crept into his shoulders. "Is she all right?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "She's fine now," Linda replied. "But this is the third time this month, Richard. I really think we need to take her to see an allergist." Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes wandering back to the documents that demanded his attention. "Linda, I'm sure it's nothing serious. Kids get allergies all the time," he said dismissively. "But what if it is serious?" Linda pressed. This time she was struggling to breathe. A twinge of guilt shot through Richard, but he quickly buried it beneath practicality. "Look, I've got a big case coming up. Can we talk about this later?" he asked, his voice betraying his fatigue. The line went silent for a moment, then Linda responded, her tone clipped. "Fine." After the call ended, Richard tried to refocus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting to Grace. He couldn't shake the memory of her red, puffy eyes and the way she had sniffled incessantly over the weekend. Maybe Linda was right to be concerned. Days turned into a week, and Linda's worry only grew. She noticed Grace sneezing more frequently, small red rashes appearing on her skin after playing outside, and her constant complaints about feeling tired. Linda tried to bring up her concerns again during dinner one night, but Richard's replies were curt, his mind elsewhere. One evening, as Richard finally arrived home late from work, briefcase in hand, Linda intercepted him in the kitchen. Her face was set with determination. "Richard, we need to talk about Grace," she said firmly. "I've made an appointment with an allergist for next week." Richard sighed as he loosened his tie. "Don't you think you're overreacting? It's probably just seasonal allergies." Linda's eyes flashed with frustration. "You haven't been here to see how bad it's getting," she snapped. "Today she could barely catch her breath after playing at the park. This isn't normal, Richard." Before he could respond, a wheezing sound from the living room froze them both. They rushed in to find Grace curled up on the couch, her face pale, her breathing labored, and her arms covered in hives. Richard's heart pounded as he knelt beside his daughter, his hand trembling as he took hers. The fear in her wide eyes was unmistakable, and it struck him like a blow to the chest. In that moment, the weight of his negligence became unbearable. Richard stayed with Grace until her breathing steadied, his earlier doubts replaced by guilt. He couldn't deny it any longer. Linda was right. Something was wrong, and it wasn't going away on its own. The next day, Linda took Grace to the allergist as planned. Richard, uncharacteristically, left work early to join them. He sat silently in the sterile waiting room, his leg bouncing nervously. When the doctor finally entered the room, he explained that Grace was likely suffering from severe environmental allergies, triggered by pollen, dust mites, and possibly other unknown allergens. "We'll need to run some tests to confirm and develop a treatment plan," the doctor said, his tone professional but compassionate. "In the meantime, I'll prescribe some medication to help manage the symptoms." Richard listened intently, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret. Relief that Grace would get the care she needed, and regret that he hadn't acted sooner. As they drove home, Grace dozed in the back seat. Linda glanced at Richard, her expression softening as she spoke. "I know you've been under a lot of pressure," she said gently. "But we're a team, Richard. Grace needs us. Both of us." Richard nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I'll do better. I promise." Linda reached over, resting her hand on his arm. For the first time in weeks, the tension between them eased. That night, as Richard lay awake in bed, he thought about how close they had come to losing Grace. The image of her frightened eyes lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of how his priorities had shifted out of balance. He vowed to himself that things would be different from now on. Work would no longer come at the expense of his family. Grace's health and happiness were non-negotiable, and he would do whatever it took to make sure she never felt neglected again. The next few weeks saw a shift in the Harlan household. Richard made an active effort to step back from work and be present for his family. He attended Grace's follow-up appointments with the allergist, sitting attentively as the doctor explained her triggers and treatment plan. Grace had a series of skin prick tests, her small arm dotted with rows of allergens. Richard held her hand, wincing every time she flinched. "You're so brave, sweetheart," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Grace managed a small smile, her trust in him slowly rekindling. The results confirmed that Grace was highly allergic to several environmental factors. Dust, pollen, certain types of grass, and even mold spores were among the culprits. The allergist provided an extensive list of changes the family would need to make at home. Special air filters, hypoallergenic bedding, regular vacuuming, and a reduction in outdoor activities during peak allergy seasons. Linda took it in stride, already making plans to transform their home into a haven for Grace. Richard, however, felt a pang of guilt as he realized how much Linda had been carrying on her own. He threw himself into the process, spending weekends installing air purifiers and scrubbing corners he hadn't looked at in years. Grace, though wary of her father's sudden involvement, seemed to enjoy his company. They laughed together as they rearranged her room, Grace choosing bright pink bedding that matched her personality. One afternoon, as Richard vacuumed the living room with an intensity that rivaled a professional cleaner, Linda paused in the doorway, arms crossed and a smirk on her face. "Who are you, and what have you done with my husband?" she teased. Richard turned, his hair tousled and shirt untucked, and gave her a sheepish grin. "I'm making up for lost time," he admitted, his voice sincere. Linda stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm. "We've all made mistakes, Richard. What matters is that we're fixing them. Together." For the first time in years, Richard felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just solving a problem. He was rebuilding the trust and connection with his family. Meanwhile, Grace's health began to improve under the new regimen. Her medication reduced the severity of her reactions, and the changes at home minimized her exposure to allergens. Slowly, her energy returned, and her laughter became a regular sound in the house once more. One day, as the family sat around the dinner table, Grace excitedly shared a story about her art project at school. "I'm drawing a butterfly garden," she said, her eyes shining. "But it's safe for me because the flowers are magic and don't make me sneeze." Richard chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Sounds like you've thought of everything." Grace beamed, and in that moment, Richard felt a profound gratitude for the chance to be there for his daughter. As Grace's health stabilized, Richard found himself reflecting on the moments he had nearly missed. He started to reevaluate other aspects of his life, questioning the choices that had led him to prioritize work over his family. One memory in particular haunted him, the trial of Dr. Isaiah Brooks. Though he had pushed the case from his mind for years, recent events brought it back to the forefront. Late at night, unable to sleep, Richard would sit in his study staring at the framed photograph of his law school graduation. He remembered the pride he'd felt, the belief that he would use the law to make a difference. Somewhere along the way, that idealism had been replaced by ambition, and ambition had blinded him to justice. The Brooks case had been a turning point. At the time, he'd convinced himself that the evidence was solid, that the conviction was justified. But now, doubts gnawed at him. He recalled the look on Dr. Brooks's face as the verdict was read: shock, disbelief, and a quiet dignity that refused to break. Richard knew he couldn't ignore these thoughts any longer. He began to sift through old case files late at night, searching for the truth he had once avoided. His mind raced as he read over witness statements and evidence logs, noticing inconsistencies he had dismissed in his rush to secure a conviction. One name in particular stood out: Mara Jenkins, a key witness whose testimony had been pivotal. Richard remembered her as a nervous young woman who had seemed eager to please. Her account had corroborated the timeline of events, but as he read her words now, something felt off. He decided to track her down, a decision that filled him with equal parts dread and determination. After a few calls and some online searches, Richard found Mara living in a small apartment on the outskirts of Maplewood. He knocked on her door one Saturday morning, his heart pounding. When she answered, her eyes widened in recognition, but her expression quickly turned wary. "Mr. Harlan," she said, clutching the doorframe. "What are you doing here?" Richard cleared his throat, his voice steady but earnest. "Mara, I need to talk to you about the Brooks case. I know it's been years, but I believe we might have gotten it wrong." Mara hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if to ensure no one else was listening. Finally, she stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Inside, the apartment was modest but tidy, with photographs of her family adorning the walls. Mara gestured for Richard to sit on the couch, then perched on the edge of an armchair, her posture stiff. "What do you want to know?" she asked cautiously. Richard took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I need to know if your testimony was accurate. Did anyone pressure you to say things you weren't sure of?" Mara's face paled, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "I didn't lie," she said quickly. "But I wasn't sure about everything. The police told me they had evidence, and they said if I didn't testify, a dangerous man might go free. I just wanted to do the right thing." Her voice trembled, and tears welled up in her eyes. "But now I'm not so sure. What if I helped convict an innocent man?" Richard's stomach churned as her words confirmed his worst fears. He leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "Mara, if there's even a chance that Dr. Brooks was wrongfully convicted, we have to set it right. Will you help me?" Mara hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. "I don't know. What if people find out? What if they think I lied on purpose?" Richard reached out, his expression sincere. "You won't face this alone. I'll take full responsibility for reopening the case. But we need your voice, Mara. Dr. Brooks deserves the truth to come out." After a long silence, Mara nodded, her resolve hardening. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll do it." Richard left her apartment with a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt he was on the path to redemption. He returned home that evening, exhausted but determined. As he stood in the doorway, watching Grace color at the kitchen table, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would not only make amends for his past mistakes, but also show his daughter the importance of integrity and justice. It wouldn't be easy, but Richard was ready to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. Over the following weeks, Richard dedicated himself to the task of reopening Dr. Brooks's case. He pored over legal precedents, drafted petitions, and reached out to colleagues who specialized in wrongful convictions. The initial responses were lukewarm at best. Some dismissed his inquiries outright, while others expressed skepticism. After all, a prosecutor reopening a case he had once championed was virtually unheard of. Still, Richard pressed on, driven by a mix of guilt and a newfound moral clarity. His first major breakthrough came when he contacted an investigative journalist named Claire Sanderson. Claire was known for her relentless pursuit of truth and her coverage of controversial legal cases. After reading an article she had written on another wrongful conviction, Richard reached out to her, hoping she might be interested in digging into Dr. Brooks's story. Their initial phone call was tense. Claire's tone was sharp, almost accusatory. "Why should I trust you, Mr. Harlan? You were the one who put this man behind bars." Richard took a deep breath, knowing he had to be transparent. "You're right to question me," he admitted. "I made a terrible mistake, but I'm trying to make it right. I have new information that I believe could exonerate Dr. Brooks. I need your help to bring it to light." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Claire finally responded. "Send me everything you have. If it holds up, I'll consider looking into it." Richard spent the next few days compiling every shred of evidence and documentation he could find. He included witness statements, court transcripts, and even internal memos from the police department that had handled the case. When he sent the file to Claire, he wasn't sure if she would even read it. But to his surprise, she called him back just 2 days later. "This is compelling," she said, her tone more measured. "I'll start investigating, but I need access to the original evidence. Can you help with that?" Richard hesitated, knowing it would mean navigating bureaucratic red tape and likely facing resistance from his former colleagues. "I'll make it happen," he promised. Meanwhile, Mara Jenkins worked up the courage to write a formal affidavit recanting parts of her testimony. She described the pressure she had felt from law enforcement and admitted that her uncertainty about the events of the night in question had been glossed over during the trial. Mara's statement, coupled with Claire's investigative work, began to form the foundation of Richard's case for a retrial. As the pieces started coming together, Richard felt a mix of hope and apprehension. He knew that reopening the case would shine an unflattering spotlight on his own role in the conviction, but he also knew it was the only way to seek justice for Dr. Brooks. The day finally came when Richard filed a motion with the court to reopen the case. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension as he stood before the judge. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him, former colleagues, reporters, and members of the community who had once trusted him implicitly. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. "I stand before you today not as a prosecutor, but as a man seeking to rectify a grave injustice. New evidence has come to light that calls into question the integrity of the case against Dr. Isaiah Brooks. I am requesting a retrial to ensure that the truth prevails." The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward slightly. "This is highly unusual, Mr. Harlan. What evidence do you have to support your motion?" Richard outlined the inconsistencies in the original case, presenting Mara Jenkins' affidavit and the findings from Claire Sanderson's investigation. He emphasized the lack of physical evidence tying Dr. Brooks to the alleged crime and pointed to alternative suspects who had never been thoroughly investigated. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Richard concluded his argument. The judge raised a hand to silence the crowd. "I will review the motion and render a decision within the week," she said before adjourning the hearing. The waiting period was agonizing. Richard spent sleepless nights going over every detail, fearing he had overlooked something. He met with Claire regularly, their discussions ranging from strategy to the broader implications of the case. "If we win this, it's not just about Dr. Brooks," Claire remarked during one of their meetings. "It's about exposing systemic flaws that allow these kinds of injustices to happen in the first place." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know. That's why we have to get it right. When the judge's decision finally came, Richard was at home with his family. His phone buzzed, and he stared at the screen for a moment before answering. It was Claire. "They granted the retrial," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you, Claire," he said quietly. "We couldn't have done this without you." The retrial was set for 2 months later, giving Richard and Claire just enough time to prepare. Richard enlisted the help of a prominent defense attorney, a man named Samuel Wright, who had a reputation for taking on tough cases and winning. Samuel's no-nonsense attitude and sharp intellect proved invaluable as they built their defense. Dr. Brooks, who had remained stoic throughout the ordeal, expressed both gratitude and apprehension. "I'm not sure I can go through this again," he admitted to Richard one evening. "The first trial nearly broke me." Richard placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This time will be different, Isaiah, I promise." When the retrial finally began, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Reporters lined the back walls, their cameras trained on Dr. Brooks as he took his seat beside Samuel. Richard sat in the gallery, unable to participate directly but deeply invested in the outcome. Over the course of several days, the defense dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece. They highlighted the lack of forensic evidence, the coerced testimony from Mara Jenkins, and the biased investigation that had ignored exculpatory leads. Mara herself took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the pressure she had felt during the original trial. "I was scared," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I realize I was wrong." As the retrial progressed, Richard found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought of Grace, whose own health crisis had been the catalyst for his change. He thought of Linda, who had stood by him even as he grappled with his guilt. And he thought of Isaiah Brooks, a man who had endured unimaginable hardship with grace and dignity. Finally, the day came for the jury to deliver their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the 4 persons stood, holding a small piece of paper. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dr. Isaiah Brooks, not guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment before cheers erupted from the gallery. Dr. Brooks buried his face in his hands, overcome with emotion. Samuel clapped him on the back, a rare smile breaking across his face. Richard felt tears streaming down his own cheeks, a mix of relief, joy, and redemption washing over him. As the courtroom emptied, Dr. Brooks approached Richard. The 2 men stood in silence for a moment before Isaiah extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Richard took the hand and shook it firmly. "No, Isaiah. Thank you for teaching me what justice really means." In the weeks that followed, Maplewood began to heal. The retrial and its outcome sparked difficult but necessary conversations about bias, accountability, and the importance of fairness in the justice system. Dr. Brooks resumed his work at the community health center, where patients lined up to see the doctor who had become a symbol of hope and resilience. Richard, too, found a new sense of purpose. Though he stepped away from his role as prosecutor, he dedicated himself to advocating for criminal justice reform. Together, he and Dr. Brooks worked to create educational programs aimed at preventing future injustices. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but as they stood side by side at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center in Maplewood, both men felt a sense of closure. Their journey, though fraught with pain and hardship, had brought them to a place of understanding and unity, a testament to the power of redemption and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Richard Harlan returned home that night feeling lighter, though the weight of his past mistakes still lingered like a shadow. He sat on the couch in the living room, his eyes drifting to the family photos arranged on the mantelpiece. One picture caught his attention: a younger Grace, perched on his shoulders, her carefree smile wide and radiant. He was laughing in the photo, a memory from a time before the pressures of work, unchecked ambition, and poor decisions had consumed his life. Linda appeared in the doorway, observing him silently for a moment before speaking. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, walking toward him with a cup of tea in her hands. Richard nodded, though he knew the answer was far more complicated. "I'm better," he said at last, his voice heavy with sincerity. "But I can't stop thinking about how much damage I've caused, not just to the Brooks family, but to ours too. I've been so wrapped up in my career that I lost sight of everything else." Linda sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his knee. "You're doing something about it now, Richard. That's what matters. You can't change the past, but you're here now, and that means a lot." Her words were reassuring, but Richard knew redemption wouldn't come easily. He would have to work tirelessly to rebuild the trust he had broken. Later that night, as the house settled into quiet, Richard lay awake, reflecting on the choices that had led to this moment. He thought about the evidence he had ignored, the times he had let fear and ambition cloud his judgment, and the lives that had been affected by his haste. Above all, he couldn't shake the image of Grace's face when Dr. Brooks saved her life. The man he had wrongfully condemned had shown incredible compassion, a quality Richard now realized he had sorely lacked. The next morning, determined to do more than just apologize, Richard proposed a series of initiatives to the town council. These included educational programs on unconscious bias and a committee to review past convictions for potential errors. Though his proposals were met with initial resistance, the town's memory of his public admission and Dr. Brooks's exoneration eventually won over enough support to begin meaningful change. Meanwhile, Dr. Brooks faced his own set of challenges. His practice was growing, but not everyone in Maplewood was ready to forget his past conviction. Some patients approached him with skepticism, and whispers of doubt occasionally followed him through town. Despite this, Dr. Brooks remained steadfast. His focus was on providing care and showing the community, through his actions, the kind of person he truly was. One afternoon, as he reviewed patient files in his modest clinic, Dr. Brooks was surprised by an unexpected visit. Richard and Grace stood at the door, the little girl holding a small bouquet of flowers. Richard looked nervous but resolute. "Dr. Brooks," he began, clearing his throat, "we wanted to thank you again for everything you did for Grace. She wanted to bring you this." Grace stepped forward shyly, extending the flowers. Dr. Brooks accepted them with a warm smile. "Thank you, Grace. These are beautiful," he said, crouching down to meet her eye level. "How have you been feeling lately?" "Much better," Grace replied, her voice small but sincere. "Mom says you're a hero." Dr. Brooks chuckled softly. "I'm just doing my job, but I'm really glad to see you're doing well." The visit was brief, but it marked a turning point for Richard. It was a step toward repairing the fractured relationship between their families. As time passed, Richard and Dr. Brooks began collaborating more frequently. They worked together on initiatives at the community center, organizing workshops to educate the town on social justice, empathy, and the dangers of prejudice. These events became a cornerstone of Maplewood's journey toward healing, drawing people from all walks of life. During one such workshop, a teenager raised his hand. "Dr. Brooks, how did you find the strength to keep going after what happened to you?" The room fell silent as everyone waited for his answer. Dr. Brooks paused, then spoke with quiet conviction. "My family gave me strength. They reminded me of my purpose. Even when I lost my career and reputation, I held on to the belief that no one could take away my integrity or my determination to make a difference." His words resonated deeply, leaving a lasting impression on those in attendance. Many approached him afterward, thanking him for his resilience and his commitment to building a better community. As the months went on, the bond between Richard and Dr. Brooks deepened. While their shared history was painful, it became a foundation for growth. Richard found himself profoundly affected by Dr. Brooks's unwavering compassion and dedication. It inspired him to reevaluate his own values and actions. One evening, after a particularly long day at the community center, Richard approached Dr. Brooks. "Isaiah, I know I can't undo the past, but working alongside you has opened my eyes. You've taught me what real strength and integrity look like. I'm grateful for the chance to learn from you." Dr. Brooks looked at Richard for a moment before replying. "It takes courage to admit your mistakes and work to fix them. You've changed, Richard, and that means something." As the anniversary of the first community picnic approached, the town rallied together to organize an even grander event. The park buzzed with excitement as families set up tables overflowing with homemade dishes, children raced through colorful decorations, and the aroma of barbecue filled the air. Dr. Brooks manned the grill with his signature calm efficiency, while Richard worked with volunteers to coordinate activities for the kids. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the festivities, Dr. Brooks and Richard stood side by side, surveying the scene. "It's incredible how far we've come," Richard said, his voice filled with awe. Dr. Brooks nodded, a small smile on his face. "It is. And it's a reminder of what's possible when people come together." Their speeches that evening were short but heartfelt, emphasizing the importance of unity and compassion. As the crowd erupted into applause, the two men shared a glance that spoke volumes. It was a moment of mutual respect and shared purpose, a symbol of how far they had both traveled on their paths of redemption and reconciliation. As the months passed, the changes in Maplewood became increasingly evident. The once divided town now found itself actively engaging in dialogues about fairness, empathy, and equality. Churches, schools, and community organizations began hosting regular forums inspired by Dr. Brooks and Richard's collaborative efforts. These gatherings fostered a renewed sense of understanding among neighbors who had previously turned a blind eye to the injustices around them. Dr. Brooks's practice flourished, not only because of his skill as a physician, but because of his newfound role as a symbol of resilience. Patients often sought his advice on matters beyond their health, trusting his calm demeanor and thoughtful insights. Even those who had once doubted him found themselves reassured by his kindness. One memorable evening, Dr. Brooks received a letter from an old colleague, Dr. Claire Livingston. She had been following his story from a neighboring city and expressed her admiration for his perseverance. "Isaiah," the letter read, "you've shown what true character looks like. If you ever need support rebuilding your research or medical projects, know that you have allies here." This letter reignited a dream doctor. Brooks had thought lost, restarting his work in medical research. With the encouragement of his family and the support of the town, he began submitting grant proposals. He wanted to focus on healthcare accessibility in underserved communities, turning his personal trials into a source of inspiration for systemic change. Meanwhile, Richard's life also took on new meaning. While he continued his volunteer work, he started mentoring young lawyers and law students. He often told them, "Your job isn't just to win cases, it's to seek the truth, no matter where it leads. Never forget the human lives behind the files on your desk." These sessions became popular, drawing attendees from neighboring towns as well. Richard's story served as a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of humility in positions of power. At home, Richard worked to rebuild the bonds with his family. He began prioritizing dinners with Linda and Grace, finding joy in the simple moments he had once taken for granted. On weekends, he and Grace started volunteering together at the community center, handing out meals or helping organize events. Grace, now old enough to understand the gravity of her father's mistakes, admired his efforts to change. One evening, as they walked home hand in hand, she looked up at him and said, "Dad, I'm proud of you." The words brought tears to Richard's eyes, filling him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One day, while reviewing a new case at the courthouse, Richard was approached by Mara Thompson, a longtime resident. "Mr. Harlan," she said hesitantly, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Dr. Brooks. I want to make things right, too. My family owns the old warehouse on Main Street, and we've been looking for a way to give back to the community. Do you think the town could use a free health clinic?" Richard's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "Mara, that's an incredible idea. I know just the person to help make it happen.